Greetings, audio Avengers! Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of the latest episode of Marvel television. Hawkeye is heading into the home stretch, and the suspense and the surprises keep coming. There is a ton to talk about. Now, there are a lot of Marvel podcasts that talk about these episodes of Marvel TV, but what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack is the way we creatively structure our conversations. Last week, we explored the series and episode themes in our Storycast, which means this week it's time to turn our attention to character arcs and actions in our Charactercast. I'm your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Faletti. Alas, Christine Kippens was a late scratch due to being under the weather, so we will have to wait for her Hawkeye insights until after the series finale. But I am extremely fortunate to be joined by the Huey Lewis of the Marvelous TV Club, Jesse Taylor. How's it going, man?
It's going well. I'm going to start to try to grow out Jack's mustache. Hopefully in a year or two, I'll be able to get that nice curl that he has on the end.
I could watch him smarm it up for a whole episode. I'm always crushed at how little time I get with Jack.
He's got that very classic soap actor way of chewing up scenery, but in a way that's it's a film like a prestige drama. So it's just, he seems like he should be out of place. And then you watch him and you're like, you're sitting there with your hands under your chin, like, please give me more. I want more Jack this week.
His whole thanks for, saving the world thing and everything. It's all too much. And I love every second of it.
Yeah.
But that's not the only thing I love about this show. It's really been delivering on every front for me. We were just talking about this before recording, the action, the character development, the storylines, the visuals are all really compelling. So I want to know, Jesse Taylor, where does Hawkeye rank for you in terms of the Marvel TV shows to this point? We're not done yet, but we've seen 4 episodes. Where do you rank it as of today?
As of today, I rank it my number 2, right behind WandaVision. And I think the biggest reason for that is our entire experience with Marvel TV has kind of been shaped by the pandemic and the world around us. We got WandaVision near not necessarily the beginning of the pandemic, but after we'd been through it a little bit, but things were still uncertain. We didn't have a vaccine. And so we got tossed into this world where we didn't know what was going on in WandaVision, and it felt like we didn't know what was going on in the world around us. We get Hawkeye when the world is opening back up more. We've got vaccines. Things feel like they're getting a little bit more back to normal. And it's also set at Christmas time, right when that season is hitting us. It's very well timed in that regard. And I don't really get how they were going to do it earlier in the year. It makes so much more sense right now. But of the moment, I think about how I felt as I was watching episodes, and Hawkeye, maybe even more than WandaVision, just feels like the show that I want to watch right now. Mm-hmm. And it just feels good to watch it. And it feels like appointment TV in a way that, as old people, we're used to. That's what we grew up on. But it's one of the rare moments of the week where, like, there's a show that I watch that I'm super into, and I'm making time to sit down and watch it. And it feels like something that's an integral part of my, I guess, TV culture week.
I am pretty much in the same place, I think, about this show. WandaVision is tough to top because of the unique experience of it and the way that it introduced this universe in such a weird and bold way. And as you say, it hit us at this time when that was basically what we had to do. We were all sitting around at home. What I think appeals to me most about Hawkeye is that while we got all these new characters in other shows like Sylvie, we didn't get to spend a lot of time with them. They usually came in a little bit later. They were very clearly supporting characters. This show feels like true forward momentum for the MCU because Kate Bishop is, I think, the title character, really. When she, even goes up to the LARPers, you get a little tease of that. And they ask who she is, and she says, Hawkeye. sent me. And that little tease is showing us, who is the real Hawkeye here? I think it's going to be a real interesting question. But also Echo, right? We have a villain who is also new and interesting, who may not be a villain for very long because we know she's getting a show, but that only adds to the mystery and intrigue and things I want to know. And so that kind of progress, of course, the show is looking back over Clint's experiences in the MCU to date. But I love how much time we're getting with all of these new faces that will be central to the MCU. They're not teases, they're not supporting characters, they're main characters, especially Kate Bishop.
And with our special guest star this week, we got Yelena, which was fantastic. And what we had in Black Widow was moving from Natasha to Yelena as either the new Black Widow or kind of carrying on that legacy. And so by having her this week, it's also, we're carrying on a story. We're not just going back and revisiting. We're not trying to fill in blanks necessarily. What we get, even with Hawkeye exploring his past, it's very vague and there are some references here and there. But really, there are things that are happening in the background. And what's important is all the stuff that's happening to Kate Bishop, that's happening to Echo, that will be happening with Yelena as well. It's female focused, it's new, and I would watch another series or set of movies or whatever about whatever happens with these characters in a way that I wouldn't necessarily if you were telling me, oh, it's actually just setting up, a Jeremy Renner solo movie or another project with Hawkeye. Oh, actually, not Hawkeye, with Clint Barton. And Natasha Romanoff. Yeah.
Well, the title of this episode is Partners, Am I Right? So we're going to talk about partnerships as a key part of this character cast, relationships between these characters, dynamic duos, all of that sort of stuff, because there's a lot of them in this episode. And we, of course, have to begin with Kate and Clint. Kate says that they're partners and best friends, but Clint rejects almost every single definition of their relationship. So, Jesse Taylor, how would you define their relationship?
They're more than acquaintances. They're not necessarily partners because they don't communicate goals to each other. I would almost call them travelers on the same path.
Ooh, that's cool. What does that mean?
In much the same way that giving that callback to Loki and Sylvie made me think about this. But Loki and Sylvie had common goals, different ways of getting there, and they weren't the best at communicating. And this relationship feels a lot like that, hopefully without them making out, because Clint's married. As far as we know, it's a monogamous relationship, and that vibe has never shown up. So fingers crossed that doesn't come in. But there are people who are bringing their own set of both experiences and glosses to what this relationship is. Clint wants us to be very transactional. He's got things he has to do that are about his own life. He wants to take care of them, get out. Sucks that Kate Bishop's involved, but if he can just figure it out, get it done, and move on, he can leave, go back home, not have to talk to anybody else about anything, live his life. And Kate comes in, and I had a read on how she introduces him to her mom and to Jack, because it paralleled the way that her mom introduced Jack to her.
Oh, interesting.
Which is that she walks in, and all of a sudden her mom says, here's a person who means the world to me. This is a dear and beloved partner who is going to be my fiance. I want to share the rest of my life with him. I didn't tell you about it. And I almost saw the way that Kate introduced Clint was just a way of trying to get back at her mom to show up in the same space in that mansion apartment that they live in and to say, oh yeah, this guy that you never met before, world famous Avenger, best friend, partner, we're on a mission. And it was such a great parallel, except for the fact that Clinton didn't buy into it at all.
Yeah, CB1 did not fly.
CB1.
But I thought a lot about siblings, actually. There's a lot of little sibling, big sibling dynamic here where the younger one is the eager pup, right? The older one's too cool for school. But obviously they are not really siblings, and that got me thinking about the relationship you were talking about earlier, Yelena and Nat, right? Because Nat denies Yelena's definition of their relationship multiple times in the Black Widow movie. It wasn't real, right? She tells her that at the dinner scene with the family after the prison break. But Yelena's most powerful moment in that movie for me is when she says, "It was real to me." And to Kate, what she has with Clint is real. Her connection to Clint defines her life all the way back to 2012. And even if he has a completely different perception of that relationship, that doesn't make her relationship to him invalid or any less real. And I thought a lot about that dynamic of Yelena and Nat. I don't know how intentional it was, because Yelena obviously rolls in here, but there seems to be a lot there about the junior partner, the younger person, looking for that validation from that more cynical partner.
One question I had for you. The scene where Clint teaches Kate the coin snap trick. What I kept thinking about is I don't think that Clint would have ever taught his kids that. Right. I doubt that any of those 3 kids knows that, even knows that their dad can do that. I'm going to guess he never taught any of the Avengers that. And that was definitely a moment where their relationship opened up. They got more comfortable with each other. But I also thought it was interesting that it came in that way of he's transferring a skill in the same way you would either parent to child, mentor to mentee, older sibling to younger sibling. And I'm interested to see where that relationship exactly ends up. Like, does he disappear and leave her with what he's learned? Or is he going to kind of be a persistent person in her life, kind of annoyed by her the same way an older sibling might be by a younger sibling, but still there when she actually needs him?
Right. Because Clint Barton's journey has been really narrowly defined to this point in the movies. And so we're just now getting this unflowering of his character and the fullness of the complexity of his life. It does feel like it would be a shame if he disappears from us after we're finally getting past just some of the tropey, fill in the gap plot roles that he was doing for all these years before. At the same time, I hope that Kate Bishop actually does shake free of Clint Barton by the end of this series. I would love for him to have a cameo or an appearance in an episode, maybe if she gets to do a second season of Hawkeye, which feels like it's very possible to me. But I don't know that I want any more than that, just because I want to see Kate with that forward momentum I was talking about earlier.
I agree, especially since we're going to be seeing all sorts of new characters that come in. And even in the 4 episodes that we've seen so far, she doesn't want to be in Clint Barton's shadow. She wants to be standing there right alongside him.
Yeah.
And I think any show, any second season to this, anything that comes forward, to be true to that character, it has to be that. It has to be that she's her own person. And I was thinking about the prior movies with Clint Barton. He's rarely, if ever, called Hawkeye. We know he's Hawkeye because that's who he is in the comics, but he doesn't call himself that. It's kind of a gloss the world gives him. And so to the extent that persona comes into being, even the addition of the purple, the way that Kate wants to brand things, they've really set it up so that she can actually be the first real Hawkeye.
Oh, yeah.
And Clint Barton will always just be Clint Barton.
Right. And she's clearly putting her branding staple on it by working with the LARPers to design whatever costume they're working on. So I think that's a great call, that she's the one who's going to define the brand of Hawkeye, that she's rattling Clint's cage about for this whole series. And instead, he's going to let her do it. And maybe he becomes her guy in the chair and we get a little bit of Clint Barton working from the shadows, because it appears he has his own guy in the chair, which we'll get to in a bit. Let's stay on Kate for a second, though, because she isn't just obsessed with Clint, Jesse. She walks in the front door and basically tries to make friends with someone who lives in the building that she is breaking into. She wades in deep with those LARPers right away on this costume front, right? Tethering herself to them in a complicated way and implying she's maybe going to join the guild. And at the same time, her mother, her actual family member, tries to pull her close, and she resists that at every single turn. Relationship-wise, what is her deal?
We talked about her relationship with her mom a couple of episodes ago when Christine and I were on. Her relationship with her mom is in a large part focused on her mom's own narcissism and need, where it's always been about what role Kate is going to perform in her life. And Kate didn't get to choose that. And so much of her life since 2012, as we've seen, has been focused on this sort of training, this self-definition, this becoming like Hawkeye, because Hawkeye was always this figure she could idealize and attempt to be like without ever having to actually deal with that day-to-day that she would with an actual parent. And now that Clint's in her life in such a sudden and intense way, you can see everything she does is just trying to get out in front of what he might say about that relationship and say, I'm going to define this relationship. It's going to be what I say and how I say. And I hope you come along because Whirlwind Kate is here. And if we look at the other relationships she built in this episode, they work the same way. She just kind of walks in and she's like, hey, Kate Bishop's here. Hope you're in for a ride, because if not, you better hop the fuck off. And sometimes people do. Guy gets off the elevator but she also intends for him to, which I thought was a great thing. She used that to her advantage and then got him out as soon as she didn't need him anymore, which was actually much more of a Clint move than a Kate move to this date. So maybe she's learning something from him. Maybe he's training her on that. But with the LARPers, it was full on, I need you for something, you need me for something, but it was an exchange. And I think she just really enjoyed the fact that it was going to be this equal exchange where she could get something from them and vice versa, in an actual healthy, fulfilling relationship that she might not have in her family.
Her obsession with Clint makes sense, but that LARPing thing shows how lonely she really is, which speaks to the fact that she can sense that I think her mom is fake as hell, that what her mom wants from her is not what we would consider probably a healthy parent-child relationship. But we see Eleanor, without Kate around, very clearly concerned for her safety. Do you think, since we're talking about relationships, I'm curious, do you think Eleanor truly loves Kate?
That's always hard. And the reason for that is that it's a parent-child relationship. Mm-hmm. Even the worst parents, not even the worst, there's a group for whom this does not apply, but it's even the kind of most emotionally inattentive or absent parents feel like they love their kids, even if they actually don't. I think Eleanor feels something that she calls love, which is a sense of maybe attachment, of wanting to pass on what she's built, of wanting to protect this person that she's supposed to protect. After all, her entire job is professional security. Her role is to be a protector. But at the end of the day, what she's protecting is herself. And I think what we'll see as we move along, and we'll get into this a little bit later in the episode, is that she's not there to protect Kate from the world. She's there to protect herself from Kate. And the only way she can do that is to keep Kate close enough that she can feel like she has some control over what she's doing.
I like what you're saying there, because it sounds like Kate is almost more of a possession or a pet even, something you love, but maybe not in a way that sees that object as a full and real person, because she wants Kate close to her. She wants her loyal and obedient, like you said, doing predictable things that don't cause her any trouble and taking no risks. That's not exactly how a parent really ought to be thinking about their kid. I know there's a lot of pressure these days on parents to not let their kids take any risks, but there's a point at which you kind of have to let a 22-year-old do their own thing. The other thing I would bet is that if it really came down to it, I don't think Eleanor would choose Kate over Eleanor. And we may find out whether or not that's true in this series. But that's the real test of that level of love. And I don't think Eleanor's quite got it in her.
So here's my question. Playing off of that, does Eleanor actually love Jack?
One of my favorite physical acting moments in this episode was Vera Farmiga's flushed face and the way she kind of brushes her hands down her cheeks after the dance sequence. There was something incredibly genuine. It was so striking that Kate was thrown for a loop watching her mother be that happy. And I'm inclined to say yes.
I'd agree with that. And I think it may have even been a situation where she wasn't expecting to fall in love, and she did. And there's a distinct difference in the way she treats Jack versus the way she treats Kate. She treats Jack like a partner, which is what she should. They're partners. They should. But she doesn't even really treat Kate like her child who's been there her entire life. It's a very odd way of seeing a parent and child interact, because Kate feels much more like a visitor than Jack ever does. And Eleanor is setting that up. Eleanor is structuring their relationship so that Kate is a visitor in her own home and in Eleanor's life in a way that Jack absolutely is not.
Yeah, Jack's always the one going to make tea and coming out of the kitchen, behaving in a very home-oriented fashion. There's a lot more to unpack on Eleanor and Jack, but let's stick with our title relationship here of Clint and Kate. Let's talk about Clint a little bit more. Because something you noticed when we were texting about the episode, right, was that he was drinking out of a Thanos Was Right mug during the holiday montage with Kate. That pops up a couple times, including the morning after. It's really prominent. And the dissonance between the happy-go-lucky feel of most of that montage and that mug and its implications was really strong. So what gives with that?
Something I've noticed across all of the post-blip MCU stories is that the blip itself is an issue. There's blip support groups referenced in Shang-Chi, the blip, and what was it called in Falcon and Winter Soldier? The Global Reconciliation Commission.
Yeah, something like that. Man, yeah, it's already fallen out of my head.
I know, whatever the New World Government was. But everything is about the blip and not about Thanos. And so I keep wondering, what does the world think Thanos is or was? Because Thanos never did the broadcast to the entire globe or the entire universe. I'm not sure if most people even know who Thanos was or what he looked like. They just know he was a concept and this force that gathered these incredibly, impossibly powerful stones and then just fucking killed half of everybody. And so I could also see it being this kind of nihilistic meme of you just say Thanos was right. Anytime anything in your life pops up that you don't like, Thanos is right. And so I could even just see it being like a Twitter thing. You know, you just hop on and somebody has a bad take and you're like, Thanos was right. Like, you wouldn't have said that if Thanos had won. Maybe it's just turned into that something that's such a kind of background saying to process what happened that it's not about Thanos at all.
That's interesting, because it feels to me like the fact that it also came up on the toilet graffiti in the first episode, I think it was, it just feels like it's there for a sense of dread to remind us that when Clint is doing these supposedly happy things, right? He's at the musical at the beginning of the series when he sees it. He's having this fun holiday montage that, like, sitting in the back of his brain is all of this impact from Endgame and Thanos taking his family, Thanos ultimately, because of his actions, taking Nat or forcing him and Nat into that impossible situation. And that's what it feels like thematically. But I'm like, why would Kate's aunt, why would Moira Brandon have this mug? Is she into the radical movements that we saw in Falcon and the Winter Soldier? I don't know. It was a really weird choice because, again, thematically, it makes sense to me. But physically, tangibly, I'm definitely legitimately confused. I like what you're going with this sort of meme-ified version, though.
Yeah. Because I had to come up with the reason that you would just have a coffee mug sitting around.
Yeah.
Like, it's one thing if it's a political statement, but, you know, I look in my cabinet over the coffee maker and we've got a few funny mugs. There's a couple of ones from Schitt's Creek, from The Good Place, things like that, just quotes and stuff. But it's all stuff that they're just kind of little jokes from things you liked at the time. I just can't imagine having a mug that was like genocide. A-okay.
Can I throw one weird other little wrinkle in? it's really faded. And that means the mug probably was bought and used while the blip was still happening. In other words, somebody saying Thanos was right while they still thought nobody was ever coming back. That's a pretty radical political statement, I would guess.
I know. And you have to imagine that if half the population appeared, there'd be a ton of upheaval, but there would be some people who would be a lot better off. And it might be that they're better off personally, an abusive partner leaves, or they get to pursue their dreams because there's opportunities open that weren't before. And it might also be about the fact that the blip wasn't just Hawkeye's kind of 5 years of loss and trauma and pain. Other people had different experiences that weren't nearly as bad and aren't necessarily what Hawkeye's were.
Well, that mug was far from the only endgame call-out, Jesse. When Clint was cutting Kate loose, when she was asking to be pulled up, that was a really powerful inversion of Nat's final scene in Endgame when she was asking to let go, but Clint tried to hold on. What do you take away from that inversion? Kate dangling on the line, asking to come up. Clint looking down, the Endgame music is played, and instead this time he cuts the line and goes the complete other way.
I think that the underlying current of Clint and Kate's relationship is that he is never going to have the same relationship with someone else that he had with Natasha. Mm-hmm. And he's never going to treat somebody the way he treated her, never necessarily trust somebody the way that he trusted her. But at the same time, he made a decision that to him, and I think correctly, in the moment protected Kate. It got her as far away from two trained killers as possible. And she chose to come back up. She made that choice herself. He didn't tell her to. But it was Clint doing, I think, what he felt he could do in the moment to protect his friend. So I think it was almost, even though the physical act was different, it was letting go rather than trying to hang on. It was actually the same impulse that drove him to try to keep Nat from falling.
I think you might be right about that, actually, because in Endgame, he was trying to hold on to his humanity by holding on to Nat, right? Because she was basically this last connection to him being a human being. He didn't have his family back yet. He'd turned into this psycho killer. And so Nat was this thing to hold on to that was really his own humanity, because in some ways he was saying, I'm dead either way, so let me do this, because if you die, then I feel like I'm lost anyway. But then with Kate in this scene, Clint's trying to cut the connection with her before it turns into something that could once again rob him of his humanity through trauma. So he doesn't want to care for anyone beyond his family the way that he cared for Nat. He does not want to expand his found family, basically, because, and especially because, Kate's going to be risking her life probably pretty regularly. So he's severing the vulnerability before what I think he would call it is metastasizing, because that's how I think he might think of it at this point. And so in both cases, I think Clint's trying to save himself or some part of himself as much as he's trying to save somebody else, which could be read as selfish, but I also understand why he does not want to open himself up to the same kind of loss that he had before, even though that the prior to the loss was the one thing he was holding on to.
And what's interesting now is that Clint actually has something to hold on to and to live for. He's got his family. Mm-hmm. And it really makes me wonder what was going through his head during that rooftop fight, because he was strategically putting himself in a worse position. Getting rid of somebody who could help him would make it more likely that he would get hurt or die. But he also did that to protect the life of the other person. And so you have to wonder if going through Clint's mind, and maybe this is why he was also drinking out of the Thanos Was Right mug, there's a possibility that in Clint's mind, Thanos may have been right, but it may have been him who was supposed to die, not his family. Take me, leave my family behind. At least they'll be taken care of. They'll be safe because I'll be gone. And if I'm out of everybody's life, nobody's going to face the same threats they do. Because right now, I mean, what the show is about is all of the things that Clint has done during his life, the repercussions of those actions coming back in full force in 1 week right before Christmas. And I could see him just thinking, do some basic calculus and say, well, if I just take on the brunt of this, everybody else is safe and nobody has to worry. And who's really going to miss me? Even going back to the original Avengers musical that we saw at the beginning, where it's like he's overwritten for Ant-Man because even Ant-Man has a bigger impact and mark on the world, at least in terms of how they view the past decade plus, than Hawkeye has. And so is there kind of a sense for Clint that like, who's really going to miss me if I'm gone?
Which also feels like it ties back to that Endgame scene a little bit where, yeah, again, there's a sense that he's trying to sacrifice himself all the time at some level. That's a really good point. But you mentioned his family, and they do seem to have that nice house. We obviously saw the farmhouse in Age of Ultron. Presumably they're still there. Laura seems like a stay-at-home mom. I have a lot more thoughts about that we'll get to later. But Clint doesn't exactly seem like he's out there running around being a mercenary for hire or anything like that. So something that, has been unaddressed by this show to this point, while a family's out there having a week on the town in NYC, at least most of the family. I don't know, Jesse, how do you think Clint and or the Barton family make their money?
So I have a lighter theory and a heavier theory.
Okay.
The lighter theory is that Clint, regardless of how much he tries to hide from it, has to be one of the, I'd say 20 to 25 most famous people in the world. Mm-hmm. Just based on everything that happens, everyone knows he's an Avenger. Even if you don't necessarily recognize him, everyone out of the corner of their eye is going to be like, I know that guy. That face is really familiar. So does he just live on royalties and basic, getting comped things? They tried to comp him that dinner and he fought against it, but obviously it had happened before. So does he just kind of live the life of an influencer where people just send him free stuff and they get by on what people are willing to give them in exchange for his service?
Do you think he would license himself as an action figure, for example? Because that could be pretty lucrative.
I don't know that he would, but I could see him for maybe a few big projects. Let's say there's a documentary and he's like, okay, pay me, I don't know if they use dollars after the blip, but pay me X amount of money and I'll do it. And then the darker theory is that he kept money from his Ronin time, that he squirreled it away, that he's got a stash based both on his years as a mercenary and also his time as Ronin. And that might come up, that he's kind of living his life based on what he got when the world fell apart and he was just killing criminals left and right.
That's a really interesting possibility, that he cleaned out some of these places, hoarded some of that cash, and has been able to live on it. I just sort of assumed maybe Tony Stark's will had a trust for these people. He can't be so callous as to not provide for them, because he's the kind of wealthy, like Bezos wealthy, where he's not going to miss tens of billions of dollars, which means surely he can do something for the Barton family, right?
Possibly, but if you think about Endgame, Clint's family was gone. All the Bartons except for Clint were gone. And did they actually know that Clint was alive until they found him as Ronin?
Unclear. Yeah, it seems like only Nat maybe had that information, and she probably wasn't in a sharing mood with Tony. As we know, their relationship was a little fraught. Why would you leave this family in a will when they're gone? And the Tony dies bringing them back, so it's not like he's thinking about pregnant Laura and the soon-to-be born Nate and all that. It's just, you're right, that doesn't really add up.
Yeah, and maybe I also have to think that Tony had some sort of will that could change as the world changed. I have to imagine he had some sort of AI or something in place that was handling all of that that was like as assets moved, it's like it changed by the second so that nothing was ever unaccounted for, especially because he had his own kid.
That's, an AI-driven will. That seems like a game you as a lawyer should be looking into. That sounds lucrative, Jesse.
I know, except then you set it up and one thing goes wrong and it's all being given over to Skynet or something.
Yeah, you create the evil AI that takes over the world. I was really enjoying our Eleanor and Jack conversations, so let's get back to the two of them. But before we get into some comparisons between them, let's talk about some details. Eleanor made an important phone call after Clint said he wouldn't let the case drop. Who was Eleanor calling from her office, Jesse?
I'm not sure. I mean, we know that we still haven't seen at least one influential figure that's been in the background, the Kingpin. So it's entirely possible she could be involved in some way with the Kingpin. It would also make sense that he would be adverse to the Duquesne family, that they would be at odds with each other. And so I could see her having some involvement there. It could also be a character we've never seen before. Could have just been a call to the security company. But my guess is, if I had to put money on it right now, I'd say probably something Kingpin or Kingpin related.
I like the Kingpin theory. That's where my head went first. I have two other theories. One is mine and one is Amanda's.
Okay.
My corny ass one is Kate's dad. Okay, so it's a first name only phone call. It's Eleanor, she says. So they are close, whoever she is calling. I wonder whether her and Wilson are on first name basis, because I feel like Wilson Fisk probably knows a lot of Eleanors. Maybe I'm wrong about that. It's not a common name these days. I don't really know. But it was also a little bit formal. And now maybe that's a Fisk thing, because they're business partners or something. But it could also be the way you might talk to an estranged husband with whom you have a secret, i.e. his faked death that allowed you to climb out of whatever mess you were in and reset themselves. They might have been close, right? And now they're not because of time and distance, but I have no idea really why she would be calling him. I'm just so weirded out by the fact that they de-aged the dad during some of that first episode, and I just feel like I want to see him come back. I might be pulling at strings there. Entirely
possible. And again, it's the body rule. We've never seen the body.
Yeah, we've never seen the body. Yeah. And I don't know. Let's not worry too much about that. I have Amanda had a fun theory, though. Yelena only shows up after the call, Jesse. Could it have been the Contessa, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, that Eleanor was calling?
I hadn't thought about that, but that's a very good point. And who else would have a group of superpowered individuals that would be able to take on an Avenger basically at the drop of a hat?
And doesn't Bishop Security feel like the kind of company that the Contessa would get in bed with? They have this extra legal surveillance tech that can find any phone number at the drop of a hat. That feels like the kind of shit the Contessa would be paying top dollar for.
Exactly. And then to be able to add to that, your own group of little mercenaries, U.S. agent, Yelena, whoever else comes along, to kind of add that on top. If you ever do, say, run into the random Avenger about town, that's a good business plan. Yeah, it's not terrible. Look, we saw some really great Jack moments, like we talked about at the beginning of the episode. His silly, messed up aphorisms, the Huey Lewis reference that that was really funny. I want to know, Jesse, is his corniness real or is it an act? If it's an act, to what end? So I'm going to take the real part of this. I think that based both on my familiarity with the comic character, the swordsman, and also just what I would prefer in terms of him being a more interesting character, you take this kind of rich doof who's really, really good at sword fighting, but is not good with money, who's kind of landed himself, like he landed the goose with a golden egg. He's like this rich woman who has the connections to take my kind of shitty little criminal enterprise that I have going on, and who could elevate it immensely if I can just charm her enough. I think to the extent it's an act, if it was, it no longer is. Like, that's who he is. He's put it on for so long that who he is this guy who just eats butterscotches and can't really remember the phrases and loves the same music that, actually, no, in American Psycho, did he hate Huey Lewis in the News or did he love Huey Lewis in the News?
I think he loved it, but man, it's been a minute.
Here, I'm going to look that up because I can't remember. I remember he was super racist about somebody's music, but I can't remember.
Well, while you look that up, what I will say about Jack and Huey Lewis specifically is that is a deep cut for corniness. If you were a faker, I feel like you would choose someone like Bon Jovi, but no, I think only an OG cornball could actually say Huey Lewis. I think you kind of have to mean it. Otherwise, how do you pull that one off? Unless he is just somehow the greatest improv actor in their world, I don't know that you could do that. He also seemed genuinely hurt or shocked when they told him that the aphorisms were wrong. But at the same time, there's a shit-eating grin the whole time. I'm really on the fence, buddy.
But I just feel like there's a certain kind of rich person that might only exist in my head, but I feel like does exist in real life, who's like their face naturally goes into a shit-eating grin. And he feels like that exact kind of person. Like just that person who like the way that they interact with the world is by smiling through it until they're pushed in a different direction. And I think it's a natural response. I think it's who he is.
Did you find out the answer on American Psycho?
Yeah. He loved Huey Lewis in the News. I'm reading the quote, and I forgot it's an entire long monologue about Huey Lewis in the News. But the early work was a little too new wave for his tastes, but then they came into their own commercially and artistically. He thinks that Huey has a far more bitter, cynical sense of humor than Elvis Costello. And he thinks that their undisputed masterpiece is hip to be square. Again, going to the corniness.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. A song so catchy, most people probably don't listen to the lyrics, but they should, because it's not just about the pleasures of conformity and the importance of trends. It's also a personal statement about the band itself.
What a great pull by you. There's probably some significance to this idea of tying Jack to American Psycho, because obviously there's a lot of, bloody blade work in that movie, and that's probably meant to be somewhat dreadful. Great call, man.
Man, my one movie throwback just landing on it.
That's a great pull. I was crediting him for pulling Huey Lewis, but no, in fact, it's probably the show pulling American Psycho. Well, now I got to ask you, Jesse, who will turn out to be the bigger bad guy given all of this information, Jack or Eleanor?
Initially, I was thinking that Eleanor would be the bigger bad guy, but we also know from that call, until that call, I would have said her. Mm-hmm. But we also know she's working with somebody who she has to call in favors from, which means she's not at the top. There's somebody above her. So the real question is, are they going to end up being partners or adversaries? My guess is probably adversaries over partners, just because they're hiding so much from each other, at least as far as we know. I think that Eleanor is going to be the bigger bad guy overall because of her personal ties to Kate. Thematically, it makes more sense, I think. We also haven't seen her villainous side yet. We've seen her not great mom side, but we haven't seen her more plans of conquest and deception and thievery side yet. So I'm waiting for that.
So is it your position then that Jack and Eleanor are playing each other, that they both don't realize that the other one is essentially a master schemer?
I think that's 100% what's going on. I think it's two people who both think they're playing each other. And at some point, I think they're going to show up at the same spot and just ask each other, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? I think Eleanor thought Armand was the brains and Jack was the sexy cornball who she could kind of use to get in with the family. And Jack clearly has bigger plans and bigger designs. He didn't just get that sword because he thought it was cool. He definitely wanted the suit and the sword for a reason, and he had plans. So I think Eleanor's further along in whatever she's doing than Jack is, but Jack might have the element of surprise.
It would be fun for that scene when they both realize that the other one is scheming and doing bad shit. I want to make the case, though, that they are in it together, buddy. Here we go.
Okay. Persuade me.
Yeah, there are swords in Eleanor's house when Kate arrives, but do we know for sure that it was Jack who brought them in? Because we don't ever actually get that confirmation. And I will say that does not necessarily... We also get no confirmation that the sword that killed Armand was Ronan's sword. It was just a sword. Are we sure that Eleanor is not the one who went over and killed Armand? After all, she was the one fighting with him. It could be the case that that happened, and since Jack had the butterscotch, could be coincidence, but could also be Jack proving that, you know, they worked together on that. I don't know. Here's the other thing, though. She drops the gnat line on Clint at the elevator, which is cruel and calculated to throw him off. And then she brings up the question of his kids, which we later learn that Echo already knows that Clint has kids. So it could mean she's aware of that information. That would tie her to Echo, which ties her to Fisk. Jack is tied to Fisk because we know he's the CEO of a front company for the tracksuit mafia. So I think they might just be working together. But then there's Jack's shit-eating grin, Jack downplaying his sword play in front of her. Those are still the unanswered questions if they are in cahoots.
Right. Like, part of what you just like it all makes sense. It has a little bit of the pictures on the board with the red yarn between them feel, but also that's how criminal enterprises work.
Right.
And the thing about it is we've actually gotten virtually no scenes, if any. Have we? Any scenes where Jack and Eleanor are alone together? Like, we never see their life together apart from having to perform in front of Kate.
Great point. I think that backs up my idea, though, because then that means that probably that his shit-eating bullshit is, well, except it is clear. I 100% buy Eleanor's whole absence makes the heart grow older story, and that only happened between the two of them. So there is some sense that his corniness is ever present.
But he could also just be the trackball did I just call him the trackball mafia?
The trackball mafia is such a great name for them. Because they're so retro, buddy.
Yeah, like a Windows 95 based gang.
That's hilarious.
But the tracksuit mafia, they're kind of corny too.
Yeah. I also like the idea of Eleanor and Jack having a meet cute at work. You know, he is the assassin for hire, you know, who's getting into the embezzling game to level up a little bit. And she's the supervisor and they shouldn't be dating. But, you know, Wilson Fisk probably has some pretty light HR rules in his criminal enterprises. And they just can't resist each other. And he takes her to a dancing lesson for the first time. And all of a sudden it's a whirlwind romance. Because I will return to what I said earlier. I believe the flush of love, or her version of love anyway, that Eleanor has for him.
Mark, I'm going to pitch you a Hallmark Christmas movie about their meeting. So Eleanor and Jack are each criminal masterminds who have to say, shake down or kill the owner of one of the most beloved Christmas shops in New York City because they need the real estate for some sort of Fisk enterprise. And so it's just a crisp hour and 32 minutes, like every Hallmark movie, of them discovering what love is, what Christmas is, and ultimately achieving their goal, maybe having their first kiss over the corpse of this owner. Who knows?
Shit, man. Their relationship then would kind of parallel Cassie and Maya, right? They seem like they have a little bit of workplace romance tension, and Maya's also the boss there. And I don't know, could be a thing. I can't wait to find out. I want to see who they really are to each other. I love that point that you made, that we haven't seen just the two of them talking. And I'm desperate for that scene, mostly because I just want more Jack.
Yeah. And who doesn't?
Yeah. Well, okay, so we got some new people. Well, one new person in particular that we got to talk a little bit about. And that's Yelena. She is back. She didn't say a single word, Jesse, but she is back. So I want to start here. Why do you think she engaged Clint Barton, world famous combat expert, in close combat versus just blowing off his head with a sniper rifle.
I'm thinking back to Black Widow, and I mean, she's smart, but she's also a fighter. And one of the things we saw, even when she engaged with Nat in that movie, is she does like getting up close and personal. And I also think that her goal there wasn't necessarily, it may not even have been to kill Clint. There were a couple of times during that fight scene where she could have killed both Clint and Kate, and she didn't. I also have a question for you. Did it seem like the Widow stings were weaker than they were before?
It seemed like they were set to stun, if I can borrow a Star Trek phrase, right? Yes. That phaser was clearly designed to slow and incapacitate because they hit multiple people multiple times, and it was definitely a stun, a slow, not a kill. And I'm sure that they could have killed if she had wanted them to.
Yeah, and so I got the sense that she wanted to make her presence known for reasons that we'll probably find out next episode or maybe in the future. But I don't think she was there to kill.
I think you might be right. Although I will say, I wonder if that was a decision made on the fly, because there's a possible cool tie-in to what Clint was talking about. Kate asks Clint what was his best shot ever, and he said it was the shot he didn't take on Nat. And the reason is that he sensed something that she wanted to turn, right? I wonder if Yelena could have been looking through a sniper scope at Hawkeye sitting very still on that roof, very easy target, and watching him have this interaction with Kate and having a sense that perhaps she does not have the full story about Clint and what's going on with him. Or maybe she didn't want to kill Clint in front of this young woman who she clearly seemed to have, a modest amount of affection for by the end of that fight scene. So I wonder if she just chose to subdue him for questioning on the fly, given the Kate-Clint interaction of it all. I don't know.
Yeah. And to the parallel that you brought up, I thought that also came up one more time when Kate doesn't shoot Yelena.
Oh, yeah. She has the drop on her 100%.
Yep. Doesn't take the shot. And I think Kate had the same read that there's something going on here. And let's give this a chance, because Clint also, he was fighting, but he didn't seem to, nobody in that fight except for Echo seemed to be going for the kill.
And even Echo was pretty, I mean, she went in for some kicks and punches, but she didn't pull any guns out. So Yelena did have a gun out, right? She did point it at Kate at one point, but it did seem as more of a defensive gesture. She could have pulled that trigger, and then Clint stepped in front of Kate, and if Clint was just her target, he was standing there ready to kill. So that's a good sign. But when Kate had the drop on her, Yelena does the cool head shake, don't do it, it's cool. But then she just bails. Why did she just get the hell out of there at the end instead of say something or anything?
Yeah, and she wasn't dressed necessarily like a widow. She had the widow sting, but she was dressed in a way that it didn't read to Clint like she was a widow, obviously. He said he thought that it was Echo on the roof, thought that it was Maya. Mm-hmm. And so it's clear that she wasn't there in the same role and capacity as she would have been had she been either actually being a widow or acting as a widow. So it's also interesting to see, we know from the end of Black Widow that she may somehow be in league with Contessa, but does that necessarily mean that as of today, she actually is? She could have heard the pitch, heard her attempt to persuade her that Clinton Barton was the one who'd actually killed Nat. Maybe she didn't believe her. Maybe she's a free agent now, or maybe she's just got some other agenda altogether that we just have never seen on screen.
Hopefully we will learn a little bit more about this backstory with her and how we got to this point, because it feels like she's coming back. And Jesse, I want to know, how do you think Clint will diffuse the situation the next time she shows up? How do we prevent it from coming to blows again?
So that's a good question. My guess is that Clint has too many things on his plate right now. If I had to put a marker down, I would say that the next time they meet will be when she can get the drop on him and he's either immobilized or has some reason not to start fighting. That's if she wants to say anything to him. It could just be that she wants him to know she's there, she's watching, and it could be about the Rolex. It could be about Kingpin. It could be about something else altogether. But I feel like the next interaction is still going to be on her terms. Because at this point, if you think about everything Clint has to deal with, nothing's actually gotten resolved yet, and everything's only gotten more complicated. So it's just hard for me to say to think that Clint is going to be the one who's dictating the terms of any conversation they have.
It'd be wild if she just never says anything. She shows up in each of the last 3 episodes, but has no lines at all. That'd be pretty.
That would be amazing. Like, we paid Florence Pugh to show up, and she's not talking.
Yeah, she just does some cool head shakes and flips and stuff. I would say we could call back also to what you were talking about with Clint and his behavior, which is that he might offer himself up to her without a fight the next time that she shows up as kind of a sacrifice. And she might be able to read the guilt on him about Nat, which also is probably not what the Contessa has told her based on that little end credits sequence in Black Widow.
Yeah. She strikes me as a person who's smart enough to understand the relationship that Clint and Nat had, and that it has to be more complicated than he killed her.
Well, you mentioned the other person on that roof was Maya/Echo. And of course, there's the MacGuffin, which is the watch that they were pursuing in this episode. Clint said that the identity of the watch owner is a secret and somebody who was out of the game for a while. Jesse, whose watch will that turn out to be?
Okay, so I have a theory, but I think you've asked all the questions this episode, so I'm actually going to make you answer first to see if we're on the same page.
All right. Well, I'll tell you my worst theory, my what I thought was a good theory, and then what I think the right answer is.
Okay.
Yeah. So first I thought about Peter Parker because he's one of the few heroes with a secret identity. But of course, we know how he got exposed, that Mysterio does that at the end of Far From Home. But it was a real struggle for me when I put this question in our list to come up with an answer. I didn't have one when I put it in just because Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, Doctor Strange, Scarlet Witch, Vision, Black Widow, everybody's identity is known. And, even Ant-Man, I think, Rhodey's identity is known. Sam Wilson's identity is known. Just running down the list, it felt very difficult to imagine who could be tied to that watch. So I had a second thought, which was Talos, the Skrull from Captain Marvel, who also turned out to be Nick Fury in Far From Home. Another Spider-Man connection there. I could imagine a world in which he was a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent back in the day, and that this could be a tie to the exposure of the Skrulls that would lead into the whole upcoming Secret Invasion series. But then why would that watch be at Avengers Compound, and why would Laura know about it? Because she is the one who brings it up to Clint. And in the third or fourth watch of the episode that I had today, because I watched it early, I watched it at lunch, and I watched it after dinner, I did notice that she mentions it to Clint. It's not Clint who thinks about the watch. And so Laura also has the transmitter to the watch, whatever that means, at their house. And that means it's probably Clint's watch and that it's tied to Laura somehow. And almost every single SEO-driven clickbait pop culture site has an article up about the watch, and everybody is pointing to Laura. The question is, who is she? So if the watch was Clint's and it was somehow tied to her and that she was able to maybe be his guy in the chair, right? I said I was going to mention that again. Could be the case that Laura has been that for a lot more than this series. But who is she, and is she in hiding? Because that would explain why she wasn't with the family in the New York City trip. It felt so odd for mom to be at home while the kids and dad are at the play. Could it be that she's somebody important whose identity is not Laura Barton, or obviously she's a Barton now, but she was an ex-S.H.I.E.L.D. agent? There could be a Mockingbird connection, which would make Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. definitely not canon. I was also wondering if she was Fisk related. Could she be a daughter, a sister, or an ex of Fisk? I don't know. So that's where I ended up. I go with the internet. It is probably tied to Laura.
And I saw all those SEO clickbait things too, because one of the things you have to do whenever you watch any MCU TV show is anytime a new object or proper noun or reference comes up. You Google it just to see, like, is it a throwback to something? Is it something that just came up for the episode? And I saw that. And again, I'm glad that they're actually giving Laura Barton something more to do than to be the worried wife at home, especially because it's Linda Cardellini. So you want to see her do things. You want to see her not just like, I think every single time we've seen her since Age of Ultron, she's just been in a flannel shirt and worried. And like, you want her to have some other backstory. Like, how did she fall in love and become life partners with a mercenary and an Avenger? And so there's got to be something there, something that actually got them together. Because I don't think they don't read like they were high school sweethearts, or that Clint was just like, oddly fixated on this lady with a farmhouse.
Right. That there was some damsel in distress moment and he saves her and then they fall in love or some crap.
So I have an off-kilter theory that is almost certainly wrong, but would at least kind of tie all the Avengers stuff together.
Okay.
Which is that it could be Phil Coulson's watch.
Okay.
Yeah, like maybe a watch that he was given. One of the big things about Coulson, especially in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., came up a little bit in Avengers, but was persistent in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. from what I remember of it, is that he had a watch and he would always check it, look at it. It was a very big thing that he had a watch. And it wasn't a Rolex, it was something else. But you could see that maybe he was given that by Nick Fury, or he earned it in S.H.I.E.L.D. somehow. And so it could just have some relation to the Avengers. It would also make sense for it to be in the Avengers compound. Maybe it was something that they kind of held on to as a relic of Coulson once he was gone. But weird stuff happened in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. with him, right? Like he died, he was actually alive, then he died again, and then something else happened and he came back again. I don't really know, but I don't think it's that. I think they're going to try to stay away from the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff as much as possible. Because I think officially it's not canon and it's just too much to explain and get into. I don't even think it's on Disney Plus.
I don't know that it is. It might be on Hulu or something like that.
Yeah, so I can't see them tying in a show that you can't turn back and watch immediately after you go from Hawkeye. Just thinking about the kind of the meta branding thing. Mm-hmm. But if they're just going to undo Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and it could just be a nice throwback to Coulson, maybe honoring him or something like that. But that's the only person I can think of where a watch played any role in any aspect of their personality.
And that's part of why I was wondering about the Mockingbird thing. So for folks who don't know, in the comics, this character Mockingbird named Bobby Morris is who Clint Barton is married to. And it's a fraught relationship, like most comic marriages. It eventually gets really rough and rocky or whatever. But it always felt super strange to me that they introduced the Mockingbird character in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And also very strange to me that when they introduced Clint Barton's wife in Age of Ultron, which was, I think, before Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. introduced Mockingbird, that wasn't Bobby Morris. Just, it felt very strange to me. So if it was Phil Coulson, or if it turns out that it was Laura and her real name is Bobby Morris, either one of those would be proof that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is definitely kicked out of the MCU. I'm sure it could be considered an alternate universe, Jesse, but that's about as close as I think they're going to come.
Yeah, and I don't think we're going to get any sort of multiverse episode about Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Like, it's the black sheep of the family.
Yeah, and there was going to be a separate Mockingbird show, and then they nixed it. And I feel like they might have nixed that right around the time that the TV stuff came all the way back under Kevin Feige. Folks might recall that there was originally a creative division between Marvel TV and the movies that was resolved and erased as Kevin Feige consolidated power, as one does at large multinational conglomerates. So it might have been the case that he killed that series in part because he was always looking to retcon that Mockingbird connection. I don't know. But this watch is interesting, and it is in Echo's possession. Jesse, do you have any guesses as to why Maya wanted this watch or has this watch? Why has she been pursuing it, or the Tracksuit Mafia or whoever?
Well, going back to the original auction in the first episode, it was one of the auction items.
It was. And it was what the Tracksuit Mafia, when they were breaking in, said the one thing to get is the watch.
Right. And so clearly, like, it's been what everybody's been after, and it was easy to forget because we spent a couple of episodes looking after the Ronin suit. But the only reason the Ronin suit became actually relevant is because Kate put it on, and then everybody thought the Ronin was back. With the watch, it has to have something to do with Wilson Fisk. I just feel like we've got this big, both literally and metaphorically, character in Wilson Fisk who's kind of looming in the background, who will show up, whether he's actually on screen or whether it's via phone or reference or whatever. But it has to have something to do with him. It means something to him. It has information in it. What I'm just trying to figure out is why did it end up in the Avengers compound? Because that means that an Avenger or somebody affiliated with them had to have put it there. And that's what I keep trying to come back to. I don't understand how Hawkeye's wife and or Hawkeye himself would have left a watch belonging to his wife in the Avengers compound for however many years would have been required for it to, the compound to break down, people to take the stuff, put it on the black market, and then for it to become part of the show. I'm just having a hard time if it's actually tied to Hawkeye's wife. Like, how did it end up there in the first place? And why does the Tracksuit Mafia care about that at all?
Sure. What I would say is it's a men's watch, and so it's probable that Clint was wearing it, and it would make sense then that Clint had this watch that, especially after he lost his family, he kept wearing it. But that when his wife was still around, that she was playing that guy in the chair role because she can track the location of the watch, which means that she could have been tracking Clint and working with Clint remotely the whole time he was an agent for S.H.I.E.L.D. or even as an Avenger, and helping as kind of someone in his ear doing a bunch of work. She speaks German fluently on top of all these tech skills. So it just feels like she has an agent's background. But it is odd that the Tracksuit Mafia goes for this watch, though, unless they are hoping that, as you say, it points to someone connected to Fisk. And that's why I wondered whether Laura has some connection to Fisk. In other words, she is a sibling or a foil of Fisk in some way. She goes into hiding, and he has been on the hunt for her ever since. And somehow he's got a sense that he could track her or figure it out. I don't know. There's got to be some piece of information that will clear this up for us. But yeah, it still feels like it's a complicated mystery.
Yeah, and maybe that's why Yelena is there. It could have something to do with the widows, and it would make sense why she was there then, even if it weren't to kill Clint and Barton. And again, it doesn't tell us anything about what the watch does or what it means, but it would at least provide an additional realm of background, because I feel like what we're doing is, and we've talked about this before in other Marvel shows, it's right around now that you start to get into like the law of conservation of actors and plot points, where the mystery never expands. It only gets more limited. And so we saw that in Loki. We saw that in WandaVision. We saw that also in Falcon and Winter Soldier. It's right around this point in the show, about 2/3 through, that you can only explain the mystery with what you've been presented. But I think Hawkeye's actually different. I think there's key elements of whatever's going on here that we still don't know anything about. And that we'll only see in the last couple of episodes, which we know are going to be probably 50 to 60 minute run times. So they're going to have the time to develop and expand this mystery. And then there's also the idea that just literally popped into my head as I was rambling, which is, what if it's Kate's dad's watch? What if he had something to do with the Avengers?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That's a fun idea.
He's a rich man. It's a Rolex. That's literally the only reason I have to connect it. But
I like it. Well, another Easter egg we got, Jesse, was the Bombshell Bag. So for folks who might have remembered, there was a LARPer and a police officer named Wendy Conrad. And when Clint came to claim his arrows, they were in her bag that says Bombshell on it. There are multiple characters with the name Bombshell in Marvel Comics. There are at least two that I know of. One is a hero and one is a villain. Jesse, was this just a cute Easter egg, or will Officer Wendy Conrad become one of these characters in the MCU?
I think she definitely will, because when Kate walked up to the LARPers, it was that very conspicuous, like, I'm a character and I'm introducing myself by name moment. And you don't get that. There's 25 LARPers there. Nobody else gave their name.
Right.
And so the fact that she got that screen time and then came back on, I think it means she'll come back. Now, you brought up something that was interesting about the bag and about her potential origin story as a villain. And I really liked it because it would be such a small story. And one thing Marvel doesn't have is villains who have kind of petty motivations. It's always operatic and thematic. And so can you share what her potential origin as a villain would be?
Well, sure. Okay, so first of all, it's a nice bag. She loves her bag. She's clearly very attached to the bag. And when Clint leaves with the bag and Kate promises he'll deliver it back, she does not look at all convinced. And honestly, I'm not going to blame Clint for not remembering to get this bag back, or Kate for not remembering to get this bag back. But it's probably the most prized possession that is, of Wendy Conrad's relationship. She certainly seems to imply that. And that reminds me, Jesse, of an origin story of a great villain in the MCU, one of my favorites, the Vulture, right? How does the Vulture begin but by having stuff that he wants taken away from him, and then he gets salty about it, and the next thing you know, he's hijacking Stark planes. I like the idea that Wendy Conrad is so pissed about not getting her bag back that she's like, fuck these hypocrite Avengers. They stole from me. I'm going rogue.
My God. Can you imagine a recurring villain who's just never satisfied because she can never get that exact bag back? My assumption is something, the arrows blow up in the bag, they lose the bag, they have to use the bag to hold on to something, and that destroys it, whatever it is. But we know from the moment that bag appeared on the screen, it's like, you see the gun in the first act, it's going to be used by the third act. You see the bag she wants back in the first act, it's not coming back by the third act.
Or if it comes back, maybe it's coated in some kind of Pym particle poison, and the next thing you know, her wife is dead, and I'll get you Hank Pym and Clint Barton if it's the last thing I do.
Man.
That's
Hank
dark.
Pym really does ruin everything.
Yeah, it's true. Well, in What If universe, he keeps turning into a villain or a monster, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
He's hanging by a thread of a very thin thread of decency. So I don't know. It was a great episode. Thank you for talking through all of this with me, Jesse. I'm intrigued. I can't wait for more. It's such a fun series.
It really is. And the thing that I like most about it is it's just a lot of, it does what the MCU does best, which is just put a lot of very charming people on the screen and let them do things. And at a certain point, I almost wonder, is there going to be too much charm on the screen? Like, when Yelena and Jack meet, will you even be able to stand it?
It's going to be a lot for me. I'm going to be pretty excited about it. Although, again, maybe Yelena doesn't say a word and Jack just does his big grin and, he does his weird... That can't be right, can it? And all, it's great. It's great. I love it so much. But look, if people want to talk to you about Hawkeye some more, Jesse, or they want to see what else you've got going on, where can they find and follow you?
They can find and follow me on Twitter at Jesse L. Taylor, Jesse, letter L, Taylor.
All right, legendary listeners, that is our show for today. We will be back next week with a Storycast dive into the themes of the episode and even more, again, about the series and what's driving it. If you are enjoying this show, please leave us a 5-star Apple review so we can rise in the search rankings. And if you want to talk with me some more, you can join me at the Marvelous TV Club Facebook page, on the Twitter page, on the Instagram page, all at Marvelous TV Club. And you can follow me on Twitter at Marc Faletti. That's Marc with a C. All right, team, it's time to jump off a building and I guess get a rope cut and disappear, because everybody's jumping off buildings these days. It's all the rage.
After the blip, what else are you going to do?
Got to get a rush somehow, buddy.